When I first met him, something felt different about this guy. He had this way of carrying himself that screamed professionalism, but not in that cold, corporate way that makes your skin crawl. No, this was different. He actually listened when I spoke, nodded thoughtfully at my ideas, and never interrupted me mid-sentence like so many others did. I found myself thinking, finally, someone who gets it. The trust I placed in him wasn't rushed or naive. It was carefully built through small moments of mutual respect that felt genuine in a world full of fake smiles and empty promises. The way he supported my proposals in meetings made me believe I'd found a true ally in that professional environment. When others would shoot down my suggestions with dismissive waves of their hands, he'd lean forward and say something like, "Actually, that's a solid point worth exploring further." His loyalty seemed unwavering, and I began to see him as more than just a colleague, perhaps even a friend who understood the frustration of being undervalued. Those moments of validation meant everything to me, especially when the workplace felt like a battlefield where trust was scarce and deception lurked around every corner. But here's what I've learned about trust in professional settings. It's both our greatest strength and our most dangerous vulnerability. When someone questioned his integrity, calling him an opportunist, I'd defend him with the conviction of someone who'd seen his character up close. "You're all wrong about him," I'd say. "He's just ambitious, not malicious." I believed every word that came out of my mouth, never imagining that one day I'd look back at those conversations with nothing but disappointment and regret. The confidence I had in his character would soon be tested in ways I never anticipated. Those private conversations we had outside the formal meetings felt like the foundation of something real. He'd pull me aside after presentations, asking for my analytical perspective on his ideas, saying things like, "You have this professional maturity that I really respect." Those words hit differently than typical workplace flattery. They felt earned, meaningful, like recognition for years of experience that others often overlooked. The trust between us grew through these intimate professional moments, where vulnerability and honesty seemed to flow naturally between two people who understood the game. The small gestures spoke volumes about the relationship I thought we were building. He'd offer me rides when my car was in the shop, bring me coffee during those endless afternoon meetings, and actually laugh at my dry humor that most people didn't quite get. These weren't grand gestures, but they created a sense of camaraderie that made the professional environment feel less lonely. In a world where everyone seemed to be looking out for themselves, his thoughtfulness felt like a breath of fresh air that made me believe in workplace loyalty again. Then came the test that would define everything, the moment when he needed someone to stand by him when things got tough. During a heated meeting with the directors, he was being grilled about errors in a final report that could have cost us a major client. I knew the mistakes weren't mine, but watching him struggle under that pressure awakened something protective in me. Without hesitation, I stepped forward and said, "This was a communication issue between both of us. We share responsibility here." The gratitude in his eyes as he looked at me seemed to confirm that our trust was mutual and unbreakable. Looking back now, I realized that moment was both the peak of our professional relationship and the beginning of my awakening to a harsh reality. When someone shows you their vulnerability and you respond with loyalty, you expect that same energy to be returned when you need it most. But trust in the workplace is often a one-way street, where the person who gives the most receives the least protection. The lesson I'm still learning is that defending someone's character doesn't guarantee they'll defend yours. Sometimes it just makes you an easier target for disappointment when their true nature finally reveals itself. Now, let me tell you about her, the woman who would become the catalyst for everything that followed. From the very first day she walked into our office, there was something in her demeanor that rubbed me the wrong way. She was younger, fresh-faced, with that kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested by disappointment. Her whole energy screamed renovation and modernization, as if everything we built before her arrival was somehow outdated and inefficient. The way she looked at me during introductions wasn't just professional assessment. It was judgment, pure and simple, wrapped in a smile that never quite reached her eyes. That first meeting where she truly showed her colors is burned into my memory, like a brand. I was presenting a project I'd been developing for months, explaining the methodology with the kind of detailed precision that comes from years of experience. Mid-sentence, I caught her rolling her eyes. Not dramatically, but just enough for me to notice. It was one of those moments where you question if you really saw what you think you saw, but your gut knows the truth. Nobody else seemed to catch it, but that small gesture of disrespect hit me harder than any direct confrontation could have. The frustration of being dismissed without even a chance to prove my worth was something I'd carry with me for weeks. The passive-aggressive comments started subtly, like poison being dripped slowly into a well. During team discussions, she'd make statements like, "I think sometimes we need more agility in our older delivery methods," while looking directly at me with that practiced smile. These weren't direct attacks, they were calculated suggestions, designed to undermine my credibility without her appearing malicious. He was always present during these moments, sitting there in silence, never once stepping in to defend the experience and expertise I brought to the table. That silence spoke volumes about where his loyalties were beginning to shift. The written feedback was where her true feelings became crystal clear, though she'd never have the courage to say these things to my face. In a team evaluation report, she wrote that there was a lack of alignment with modern methodologies in certain areas of our department. Anyone reading between the lines could see she was talking about me specifically, questioning my competence through carefully chosen corporate speak. The disappointment I felt wasn't just about the criticism. It was about the cowardly way she chose to deliver it, hiding behind official channels instead of having an honest conversation about her concerns. The fake mentoring session she orchestrated was perhaps the most insulting moment of all. She called me into her office, yes, somehow she already had an office while I was still in a cubicle, and delivered what she called constructive feedback. With a tone that dripped with condescension, she said, "You have such a rich history here, but we really need to keep pace with the velocity of the new market." It was her polite way of telling me I was becoming obsolete, that my years of experience were now a liability rather than an asset. The frustration of being lectured by someone who'd been there for mere months was almost unbearable. What struck me most about her approach was how she never had to raise her voice or create drama to achieve her goals. She operated with surgical precision, using smiles and corporate jargon to slice away at my confidence and reputation. Every interaction was designed to reinforce the narrative that I was the past, and she was the future, that the professional environment was evolving beyond my ability to adapt. The learning curve she expected me to climb wasn't about new skills. It was about accepting a diminished role in a workplace that increasingly valued youth over experience. The most painful part of this whole dynamic was watching how easily she gained influence, while I struggled to maintain respect I'd spent years earning. Her confidence wasn't backed by proven results, but by an ability to speak the language of change and innovation in a way that impressed the decision-makers. She understood that in many professional environments, perception matters more than performance, and she played that game with a skill that was both admirable and terrifying. The trust I'd placed in the system, in the belief that good work would speak for itself, was being systematically dismantled by someone who understood power dynamics better than I ever had. The moment that shattered everything I believed about trust and loyalty happened at a company event, one of those end-of-quarter celebrations where everyone pretends to enjoy forced networking and stale appetizers. It was late afternoon, just after the closing presentation, and I was making my way through the crowd when I saw them together in a corner of the room. The way they were standing, the intimacy of their body language, the shared laughter, it was like watching a private moment that I had no business witnessing. But I couldn't look away, because what I was seeing contradicted everything I thought I knew about the professional environment we all shared. The gesture that stopped me cold was so simple, yet so revealing. She reached up and adjusted his tie, not in a hurried, professional way, but with the kind of familiarity that spoke of countless private moments. Her fingers lingered on the fabric just a moment too long, and he didn't pull away or seem uncomfortable. Instead, he smiled at her, with a warmth I'd never seen him direct toward anyone else in the office. That smile was like a key unlocking a door I didn't even know existed, revealing a relationship that had been hiding in plain sight, while I remained blissfully unaware. When they noticed me approaching, the shift in their dynamic was immediate and telling. She turned to me with that practiced professional smile and said, "Oh, you've worked with him before, haven't you?" As if my years of collaboration and trust were nothing more than ancient history. The way she phrased it made me sound like a relic from his past, someone who'd been part of an earlier, less significant chapter of his career. He stood there silently, offering no correction or acknowledgement of the deep professional bond we'd built together. That silence was more devastating than any direct rejection could have been. The physical sensation of betrayal is something you never forget. It's like a cold weight settling in your stomach that no amount of reasoning can dislodge. I managed to maintain my composure during the rest of the event, making small talk and pretending everything was normal. But inside I was reeling from the realization that I'd been completely blind to what was happening right in front of me. The trust I'd placed in him, the confidence I'd had in our professional relationship, all of it felt suddenly foolish and naive. This wasn't just about office politics anymore. It was about the fundamental deception of someone I'd considered a friend. The week that followed was a masterclass in how quickly professional relationships can shift when personal interests take precedence. Suddenly, he stopped including me in project reviews, claiming he was restructuring the team dynamics to be more efficient. The collaborative sessions we'd always had were replaced by meetings I wasn't invited to, discussions that happened behind closed doors where decisions were made about work I'd helped create. The frustration of being systematically excluded from processes I'd helped establish was compounded by the knowledge that this wasn't just about business. It was personal. What hurt most wasn't the romantic aspect of their relationship, but the professional implications of their deception. I realized I'd been defending someone who was already planning to replace me, vouching for his character, while he was building alliances that would ultimately undermine my position. The loyalty I'd shown him was being repaid with calculated distance, and the trust I'd invested was being used against me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The learning process was painful but necessary. I was discovering that in many professional environments, personal relationships trump professional merit. The aftermath of that revelation changed everything about how I approached workplace relationships. I began to see patterns I'd missed before, to understand that the professional environment isn't just about work, it's about power, influence, and the complex web of personal connections that determine who rises and who falls. The confidence I'd had in the system, in the belief that good work and loyal collaboration would be rewarded, was replaced by a hard-earned wisdom about the reality of office politics. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most disappointing experiences, and this was certainly one of those moments that would reshape my understanding of trust, loyalty, and professional survival. The systematic dismantling of my professional reputation began with such surgical precision that I almost admired the strategy, even as it destroyed everything I'd worked to build. Suddenly, every project that encountered problems had my name attached to it. Every delay or miscommunication was traced back to my involvement, and every failure became evidence of my declining performance. She had been promoted to a supervisory role, a development that happened with remarkable speed, and I found myself under a microscope that revealed only the flaws she wanted others to see. The trust I'd once enjoyed was being systematically eroded through a campaign so subtle that questioning it made me look paranoid and defensive. The document incident was perhaps the most brazen example of how far they were willing to go to build their case against me. A report was submitted to upper management with my name listed as the primary reviewer, despite the fact that I'd never seen the document before it was distributed. When I confronted the issue, pointing out that I couldn't be responsible for reviewing something I'd never been given access to, I was told that responsibility in this department is collective, and that finger-pointing wasn't productive. The frustration of being held accountable for work I hadn't done was compounded by the realization that the system was now designed to protect everyone except me. The HR meeting that followed was one of those experiences that stays with you forever, not just because of what was said, but because of what it revealed about how quickly a professional environment can turn against someone who's lost their internal advocates. I was called in for what they termed a performance alignment discussion, where suddenly words like outdated, resistant to change, and lacking collaborative spirit were being used to describe someone who'd been a model employee for years. The woman who'd orchestrated this meeting sat there with her notebook, documenting every response as if she were conducting a formal investigation rather than a supportive conversation. What made that meeting particularly devastating was his presence in the background, observing everything with the detached interest of someone watching a chess game, where the outcome had already been determined. He didn't speak in my defense, didn't reference the years of collaboration we'd shared, didn't even make eye contact when the most damaging accusations were being made. That silence was more powerful than any words could have been. It was the final confirmation that whatever loyalty had existed between us was now completely dead. The disappointment of being abandoned by someone I defended so fiercely was almost harder to bear than the professional consequences I was facing. The project theft was executed with such casual efficiency that it left me questioning my own memory of events. An initiative I'd been developing for months, complete with research, methodology, and preliminary results, was suddenly being presented by her as if it had been her brainchild all along. She stood at the front of the conference room, walking through slides I'd created, explaining concepts I'd developed, while I sat there watching my work being claimed by someone else. When she finished her presentation, he was the first to applaud, praising her innovation and forward-thinking approach. I was invisible, despite being the actual creator of everything she just presented. The speed with which my professional standing collapsed was both impressive and terrifying. Within weeks, I went from being a trusted team member to being someone whose every contribution was questioned, whose presence at meetings was barely acknowledged, and whose years of experience were treated as more of a liability than an asset. The learning curve wasn't about acquiring new skills. It was about understanding how quickly the professional environment can shift when the wrong people gain influence over your career. The trust I'd placed in the system, in the belief that good work would speak for itself, was being systematically dismantled by people who understood that politics often matter more than performance. Looking back, I can see how perfectly orchestrated the entire campaign was. Every accusation had just enough truth mixed with exaggeration to seem credible. Every criticism was delivered with the kind of professional language that made questioning it seem unprofessional, and every consequence was presented as the natural result of my own shortcomings, rather than the product of deliberate sabotage. The confidence I'd once had in my abilities was replaced by self-doubt, and the professional relationships I'd spent years building were systematically poisoned by people who understood that destroying someone's reputation is often more effective than directly confronting them. This was a masterclass in workplace manipulation, and I was the unwilling student learning lessons I never wanted to know. The end came not with drama or confrontation, but with the cold efficiency of a corporate machine that had already calculated my expendability. It was a Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. when the email arrived. Not a phone call, not a meeting, not even the courtesy of a face-to-face conversation. Just a sterile, impersonal message thanking me for my contributions and informing me that my position was being eliminated effective immediately. The timing wasn't accidental. It was designed to minimize disruption and avoid uncomfortable conversations with colleagues who might ask questions. The trust I'd placed in the system, in the belief that years of loyalty and hard work would earn at least basic respect, was shattered by the clinical coldness of that digital termination. Walking into the office that final Monday morning to collect my personal belongings felt like entering a crime scene where I was simultaneously the victim and the evidence that needed to be removed. My desk had already been cleared of work materials. My computer access had been revoked, and there was already someone else sitting in my chair, settling into the space I'd occupied for years. The efficiency with which I'd been erased from the professional environment was both impressive and deeply unsettling. It was as if I never existed at all, as if my contributions had been so minimal that removing me required no adjustment period or transition planning. The silence from my colleagues was perhaps more painful than the termination itself. Not one person reached out to express concern, offer support, or even acknowledge that something significant had happened. The relationships I thought were built on mutual respect and professional camaraderie revealed themselves to be nothing more than convenient workplace arrangements that evaporated the moment I was no longer part of the system. The disappointment of realizing I'd been completely alone in what I'd imagined was a collaborative environment was crushing. Even the people I'd considered friends suddenly had nothing to say to someone who was no longer professionally useful to them. He never reached out. Not a text, not an email, not even a brief message acknowledging the years we'd worked together. The man I'd defended, supported, and trusted had moved on as if our professional relationship had never existed. This wasn't just about losing a job. It was about discovering that someone I'd considered a friend had been capable of watching my career destruction without feeling compelled to offer even a word of support. The trust I'd invested in him was returned with absolute silence, and that silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was beneath the professional facade. She, predictably, was nowhere to be found during my final visit to the office. The woman who'd orchestrated my downfall couldn't even be bothered to witness the completion of her campaign. There was something almost cowardly about her absence. After months of subtle warfare and calculated undermining, she couldn't face the human consequences of her actions. The professional environment she'd helped create was one where people could be discarded without ceremony, where years of service could be erased without acknowledgement, and where the architects of someone's destruction could simply avoid the messy emotional aftermath of their success. The realization that I'd been completely disposable hit me harder than the job loss itself. It wasn't just that my position had been eliminated. It was that my elimination had been so smooth, so seamless that it revealed how little impact I'd actually had on the organization despite years of dedicated service. The confidence I'd once had in my professional value was replaced by the humbling understanding that in many corporate environments, no one is irreplaceable, and loyalty is often a one-way street that leads to disappointment and frustration, rather than security and advancement. The learning process that followed was brutal but necessary. I had to confront the reality that I'd been naive about workplace dynamics, that I'd trusted people who were incapable of returning that trust, and that I'd invested my professional identity in a system that viewed me as nothing more than a replaceable component. The superacao wasn't immediate. It was a long, painful process of rebuilding my understanding of professional relationships and my own worth. But sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most devastating experiences, and this termination taught me more about loyalty, trust, and professional survival than years of successful employment ever could have. The hardest part about losing everything wasn't the financial uncertainty or the disruption to my routine. It was the crushing realization that I had been fundamentally expendable to people I'd considered essential to my professional life. The silence that followed my departure was deafening, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed every fear I'd been trying to suppress about my actual value in that environment. Days turned into weeks without a single message from anyone at the company, and I began to understand that what I'd interpreted as professional relationships had been nothing more than convenient workplace arrangements that died the moment I was no longer part of the system. I found myself returning to the little cafe where we used to have lunch meetings, partly out of habit and partly out of some masochistic need, to confront the reality of my new situation. When the familiar waiter approached my table and asked, "Where are your colleagues today?" I managed to force a smile and replied, "They've moved to a different table." The metaphor was more accurate than I'd intended. They hadn't just changed their lunch spot. They'd moved to an entirely different restaurant where I would never be welcome again. The frustration of explaining my absence to someone who remembered me as part of a group was a small but persistent reminder of how completely I'd been erased. The anger that eventually emerged was cleaner and more productive than the initial sadness had been. Once I stopped crying and started analyzing, I began to see patterns I'd been too trusting to notice before. Every conversation, every decision, Every moment of supposed support took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of what I now knew about their true intentions. The disappointment transformed into something sharper, a recognition that I'd been played by people who were better at office politics than I'd ever imagined, and that my loyalty had been weaponized against me by individuals who understood manipulation better than I understood trust. The empty mornings were perhaps the most disorienting part of the entire experience. Waking up without a destination, without the structured routine that had defined my days for years, created a void that went beyond professional identity. I'd been ripped away from an environment I'd helped build, stripped of responsibilities I'd cultivated, and separated from a sense of purpose that had given meaning to my daily existence. The learning process wasn't just about finding new employment. It was about rebuilding a sense of self-worth that hadn't been dependent on the validation of people who'd proven themselves incapable of genuine loyalty or trust. What struck me most during those quiet weeks was how thoroughly I'd been conditioned to define myself through my professional relationships and work environment. Without the daily interactions, the project deadlines, and the sense of being needed, I had to confront the question of who I actually was when stripped of all those external markers of identity. The confidence I'd once derived from being considered competent and reliable had to be rebuilt from internal sources rather than external validation. This was perhaps the most valuable part of the entire painful experience, learning to trust my own judgment about my worth, rather than depending on others to confirm it. The process of recovery wasn't linear or predictable. Some days I felt strong and clear about what had happened, understanding it as their failure rather than mine. Other days, the self-doubt would creep back in, making me question whether I'd somehow deserved what happened, or whether I'd missed obvious signs that could have prevented the whole situation. The trust I'd lost wasn't just in him or her. It was in my own ability to read people and situations accurately. Rebuilding that confidence required constant vigilance against the voice that whispered I should have known better, should have been more careful, should have protected myself more effectively. The most important realization came gradually, in small moments of clarity that built upon each other over time. I began to understand that being disposable to them said more about their character than it did about my value as a person or professional. The environment they'd created was one where loyalty flowed upward but never downward, where trust was a tool to be exploited rather than a foundation to be honored, and where anyone could be sacrificed if it served the right people's interests. The apprendizado wasn't just about recognizing red flags in future situations. It was about understanding that some professional environments are fundamentally toxic, and that preserving your integrity sometimes means accepting that you'll be pushed out by people who operate without it. If I could travel back in time and sit down with the person I was before all of this happened, the first thing I'd tell her is to listen to her instincts more carefully. Those moments when something felt off, when a comment seemed loaded with hidden meaning, when someone's behavior didn't quite match their words, those weren't paranoid overthinking. They were early warning signals from a wisdom that I'd been trained to ignore in favor of giving people the benefit of the doubt. The trust I placed in others should have been balanced with a healthy respect for my own intuitive understanding of human nature, and the professional environment would have been much safer if I'd honored my gut feelings instead of dismissing them as uncharitable thoughts. The most important lesson I'd share with my former self is the difference between kindness and loyalty, a distinction that could have saved me years of misplaced faith and eventual disappointment. He was polite, respectful, and professionally courteous, but none of those qualities automatically translate into the kind of loyalty that survives when personal interests conflict with professional relationships. True loyalty reveals itself not in comfortable moments when supporting someone costs nothing, but in difficult situations where standing by someone requires real sacrifice. I confused his pleasant demeanor and collaborative spirit with deep character, never understanding that someone can be genuinely nice while being fundamentally unreliable when the stakes get high. What I've learned about her approach is perhaps even more valuable than understanding his betrayal. She never needed to hate me to destroy my career. In fact, hatred would have made her less effective, because it would have introduced emotion into what was essentially a strategic business decision. She operated with the cold efficiency of someone who saw my removal as a necessary step in her own advancement, nothing more personal than moving a piece on a chessboard. The frustration I felt at her lack of direct confrontation was misplaced. Her smile while she stabbed approach was actually more professional than my expectation that workplace conflicts should involve honest, direct communication. The recovery process has been long and uneven, filled with moments of clarity followed by periods of self-doubt that sometimes catch me off guard even now. I still think about what happened, still feel the sting of betrayal when certain memories surface unexpectedly, still struggle with trusting my own judgment about people and professional situations. But the difference now is that I understand these feelings as part of a natural healing process, rather than evidence that I'm weak or unable to move forward. The aprendizaje isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. It's about integrating the experience into a wiser, more realistic understanding of how professional relationships actually work. The confidence I have now is different from what I had before. It's earned through surviving something I thought would destroy me, and it's tempered by a realistic understanding of how quickly professional situations can change. I no longer invest my entire sense of self-worth in workplace relationships or assume that professional courtesy indicates personal loyalty. The trust I offer now is measured and conditional, based on consistent behavior over time rather than initial impressions or stated intentions. This isn't cynicism. It's wisdom gained through experience, and it's made me both more effective and more resilient in professional environments. Perhaps the most important insight I'd share is that being targeted for elimination often says more about the threatener than the threatened. People who feel secure in their positions and confident in their abilities don't typically need to destroy others to advance their own careers. Her campaign against me revealed her own insecurities and limitations more clearly than anything else could have. Someone truly competent would have found ways to showcase her skills without needing to undermine mine, and someone genuinely confident wouldn't have required his validation to feel powerful. Understanding this dynamic helps me see the entire situation as their failure rather than mine. Looking forward, I carry both the scars and the strength that come from surviving professional betrayal. The trust I place in future colleagues will be informed by hard-earned wisdom about human nature and workplace dynamics, but it won't be paralyzed by fear or bitterness. The professional environment will always contain people like him and her, individuals who prioritize personal advancement over professional integrity. But it also contains people who understand that true success doesn't require destroying others. The key is developing the discernment to tell the difference early enough to protect yourself, and the self-respect to walk away from situations where your loyalty and expertise aren't valued appropriately. The supercar isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about using what you learned to build something better.